Welcome everyone to Developing Carbon Credits on Campus. This webinar is brought to you by Second Nature and will be recorded. The recording and the slides will be sent to all registrants in the days following this webinar. There will be a Q&A session at the end, and you can submit questions at any time using the questions function on the GoToWebinar panel. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Brett Pasinella, Senior Manager of Innovative Services at Second Nature. And joining me also is Ruby Woodside, our New England Fellow. Next slide, please. So the agenda for today, I'm going to briefly introduce the C2P2 program, the Carbon Credit and Purchasing Program. Then I'll go over the development process for bringing a carbon offset project to the voluntary carbon market. And then Ruby will go over the methodologies of the two different protocols that we've been working with in the C2P2 program so far, and then we'll have time at the end for questions. So next slide, please. So just a brief history of C2P2. That's the abbreviation we use for the Carbon Credit and Purchasing Program. So this actually developed outside of Second Nature with Chevrolet. In 2010, they worked with 11 campuses as part of their corporate social responsibility program to develop this protocol for carbon offsets and to bring those projects to the voluntary offset market. And then Chevrolet purchased and retired all of the credits that were generated through that program as a benefit to the environment and part of their responsibility program. When that ended, many of the schools that were involved were Second Nature signatories, and as we'll discuss later, once a project has been validated, that validation generally lasts for up to 10 years. So these schools still had projects that were validated on the voluntary carbon market. They were able to generate more credits, but Chevy was not continuing the program, and the schools asked Second Nature if we would be interested in continuing this program. So we've worked with 5 signatories over the last year to continue this program, gone through a second round of verification and monitoring on the carbon projects and found a buyer for them and continue this program. And now we're looking to expand it further with sort of this pilot program in New England, looking for some additional campuses that might like to get their carbon offset projects validated and to market the credit. The idea is that the proceeds from the carbon credit sales would be invested in further reduction projects on campus with the overall goal of accelerating your carbon neutrality target. And I can talk a little bit more about how that works in the next slide. So the idea behind the program is that through the sale of carbon credits, the cost savings will be magnified with the additional revenue from the sale of the offsets. That revenue could be invested in something like a green revolving fund, which would be used to finance additional carbon reduction projects, which would further reduce carbon emissions, generating more offsets that could go back into the green revolving fund to fund future projects. And in that way, greatly accelerate the campus's path to carbon neutrality. One of our participants was able to move their carbon neutrality deadline 10 years closer due to participating in this program, and that's kind of the goal we're trying to achieve. So this slide just provides some general ballpark figures of what type of revenue we're looking at. So most of the schools that we've been working with in the program so far are generating about 12,000 tons worth of carbon reductions each year in offsets. And the market value for these type of offsets is generally in the sort of $6 to $10 range per ton. And so you can see the approximate revenue generated for each campus is kind of in that that ballpark shown here. Next slide, please. So Second Nature's role is to basically facilitate this program. We provide technical and logistical support to the campuses that are participating, and that basically means we maintain the registry account on the carbon market. So everything can go through our registry account. Each campus doesn't need to maintain its own registry account and have all of the associated fees and things like that. We also are able to pool all of the credits from all of the different campuses involved in the program and look for a buyer. So we're able to sort of aggregate the offsets across the whole climate leadership network and negotiate a higher price, hopefully for the participating campuses than everyone would on their own if they were going out and trying to find buyers individually. And then we also handle all of the contracts and RFPs and all of the associated work with finding third-party verification bodies. And then what we hope do is, we make a single contract and then divide that cost among the different campuses that are participating in the program. So hopefully we are in that way getting lower verification costs than an individual campus would get if they were going to the verifiers on their own. Next slide, please. So the overall process has many steps. The main difference, the two main steps that we'll talk about are project validation and carbon reduction verification. So those are sort of two steps. So the first phase is basically getting your project validated. So you register your project with the voluntary market through our registry, which is called APX. It's listed here. And so at this point you choose if you're going to look at sort of the campus-wide protocol, looking at overall carbon reductions for your entire campus, or if you're going to focus on a particular lead building you have on campus. So we have sort of two choices for different protocols that you would use. Then we go through a process called validation, and that's basically where you're describing your project that you have on your campus to the voluntary market, to VCS, sort of describing what the project is, why it would reduce emissions, what are the mechanisms for reducing emissions, how you would measure that, et cetera, et cetera. And we work with a third-party verifier who, confirms all of that information, validates it, and then the project becomes posted as a potential project on the VCS registry that could, in the future, generate some carbon reductions. Then you go through a process of monitoring the project, tracking your energy use, your energy savings, calculating how much carbon emissions you've reduced, and completing what's called a monitoring report. Then that monitoring report goes through a verification process, again with a third-party verifier, checks the calculations, make sure you've followed the protocol for carbon reductions correctly, and they issue a certificate to APX that certifies that this project has in fact produced verified emissions reductions, and VCS issues the credits, which go into Second Nature's account, and then we're able to find a buyer and transfer those credits to the buyer and distribute the proceeds to the campuses. So next slide, please. So the first phase I talked about with the project development and the verification, each of these stages has a sort of very specific template and document that's associated with it that the campuses would complete, and the third-party verifier would examine and make sure everything was verified, and then Second Nature uploads those documents to APX registry, and APX then certifies them and submits them to VCS. So we basically have a lot of different entities with all different acronyms involved in the process, and it gets a little confusing, but a way to kind of think about it is that VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, is kind of like the stock exchange. That's where, you know, all of the credits are bought and sold and tracked of, you know, who owns which credits and things like that. And APX is our registry. So they're our way of interacting with that market. So you can sort of think of them, if the analogy is that VCS is the stock market, then APX is like our stockbroker. So it's that type of a relationship. So APX is where we submit and maintain all of our documentation, where our credits are tracked and kept in our account, and they do all of the interactions with VCS. So when this PDD, the project document description, is completed and submitted to APX, they check it over, and if it's good to go, they submit it to VCS, who would then approve it, and then your project would be officially verified and registered on the VCS marketplace. So next slide, please. Then, then you know, this is still part of that validation process. So once the project document description is completed, then that goes through a validation process with a third-party validator. The one we, you know, and these validator organizations are often the same organizations that can do third-party verification of emission reductions. So they're generally sort of energy services firms that are certified with VCS to be able to verify the documents and are familiar with the different protocols that VCS has and the process for monitoring credits and what makes for a valid carbon reduction projects and things like that. So once the project document description is completed by the campus, it goes to a third-party verifier like SCS Global. They're an example that we've used them in the past for verification of reductions, and they issue a report, you know, that supports the project, you know, explaining that they've reviewed the project, they understand how it would reduce emissions, and that is submitted through APX to VCS, and then the project becomes listed on the VCS database of all of the projects that are producing credits for the voluntary market. So next slide, please. Then the next phase is the verification of the actual carbon reduction. So once you have said that, okay, I have this valid project, this project should be generating some carbon reductions, then you have to monitor what those reductions are. So, you know, this is basically tracking your electricity savings, your natural gas savings, you know, whatever it is that's creating that emissions reduction, you're monitoring those reductions and savings and completing this monitoring report, which then again is verified by a third-party consultant. So, you know, this would be like SCS Global or some of the other verifiers that are out there. And again, the report is then submitted through our APX account to VCS, who, you know, approves or denies. And once VCS has approved the report, then they issue credits into our account on APX, and the credits are available for us to go and find a buyer to deliver the credits to. So now I'm going to turn things over to Ruby to talk about the two different methodologies that we've been working with, and sort of walk you through the process and what's behind each of the different methodologies.
Thank you, Brett. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific methodology that we use for C2P2, which is called the Campus Clean Energy and Energy Efficiency Methodology. So this methodology was actually written by Chevrolet, an organization called the Climate Neutral Business Network, as well as the 11 pilot campuses, and they work with several other stakeholders in the process as well. So the methodology itself is approved by VCS, the Verified Carbon Standard, and you can find it on their website. So what this means is that any credits that are developed following this protocol, they will be issued through VCS. which is one of the main standards on the voluntary carbon market. And I do want to mention that obtaining approval from VCS or any of the main standards, it's a very long process, and so it did involve a lot of stakeholder input, and it went through many series before being finally approved. Next slide, please. So one of the interesting and kind of unique things about this particular methodology is that it uses a combination of performance benchmarks and project-based approaches in order to determine additionality and to calculate the credits that campuses can generate. So I'll explain a little bit more about that later, but I do want to say that this methodology is written specifically for higher education, so it's designed for campuses. And prior to this methodology being written, there were it's first of its kind. There weren't no prior methodologies that allowed campuses to interact with the voluntary carbon market in this way. So within the overall methodology, there are two modules or two options that schools can follow if they're interested in this. So one of them is campus-wide and one is building-specific. So the campus-wide module quantifies emissions reductions across the entire campus, and this can be any combination of renewable energy projects, energy efficiency, energy conservation activities. It's really open, and it's up to the campuses to determine what activities they're going to implement to reduce their overall emissions. And the other option is for LEED certified buildings specifically. So in this module, an individual building, and it could be one or several buildings on campus, they are developed as the project instead of the entire campus. And so this can be used for existing buildings that are LEED certified or become LEED certified, and it can also be used for new construction projects. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to go in a little bit more detail about the Campus-wide module. So as I mentioned, this module looks at energy-based greenhouse gas emissions across the entire campus. More specifically, it only looks at Scope 1 stationary combustion emissions and Scope 2 electricity-based emissions. And so as I mentioned before, the methodology is a combination of performance benchmarks and project-based calculations. So in this case, additionality is calculated by looking at the annual % reductions in campus-wide emissions over an eligibility period. And the additionality eligibility period is typically 2 to 5 years. And during this period, the school's average annual % reduction for emissions, it must meet a performance threshold. And the performance threshold is outlined by the methodology. So if schools reach that level, then they're able to claim additionality, which just means that the emissions reductions will not have happened in a business as usual scenario. It would not have happened without the existence of this specific project. And so along with meeting the performance threshold, the schools also have to show a net decrease in energy-based emissions over that additionality eligibility period. So they do have to show that there's a net environmental benefit in that during that period. And then once, the idea is that when schools, if they meet the benchmark and they show the net decrease, this really means schools are going above and beyond, and that, and they're able to claim that their credits are an additional benefit to the environment. And so once the performance benchmarks are met, then credits are calculated relative to a baseline period. And the baseline period is determined over 3 to 5 years prior to whatever date the school decides is going to be the project start date. Next slide, please. So I want to talk a little bit more about how the additionality performance benchmarks are determined, because a lot of schools have been asking, what are the benchmarks and how do they know if their campus is eligible. So just a little bit of the history. These performance benchmarks were determined during the writing of the methodology with Chevrolet. So they went through extensive stakeholder review as well, and they're based on all of the schools that are reporting through the ACU PCC on their greenhouse gas inventories, and they only looked at schools that had at least 2 years of data. So what they did is they looked at all the schools that were part of, that were reporting, part of the Climate Leadership Network, so those are already leading schools, looked at a data period from, I believe, 2007 to 2011, and it was determined that the top 15% of these schools, in terms of their yearly average emissions reductions, they were considered to be really exceptional leaders of the leaders. So it was determined that being in the top 15% meant that their emissions reductions could be considered additional. So the performance benchmark, it was set at the level that you would need to be in that top 15%. So if you look at the table here, the PVSC stands for the performance benchmark for the stationary combustion emissions, and the PVEC is the performance benchmark for the electricity-based emissions. So they're calculated separately, and they're also differentiated by Carnegie class. So these are the levels of average annual emissions reductions that schools need to meet over the additionality eligibility period, which is, again, a period of 2 to 5 years prior to the project. And if schools meet these levels, then they are eligible to develop credits through this methodology. And then along with meeting the performance benchmark, schools also need to demonstrate that they are engaged in at least 2 of the following activities. So it's pretty open. This could be behavior change campaigns, cogeneration, fuel switching. A lot of schools have done lighting retrofits, renewables. Could be boiling retrofits and central heating upgrades, as well as building level system upgrades and retro commissioning, weatherization. You can also include LEED certified buildings within the entire campus, or other innovative strategies. So it's the interesting thing about this module is that it's really up to the schools to determine what exactly they're going to do to be reducing their emissions. Next slide, please. So I'm also going to go over how exactly the credits are calculated. So once these projects are verified, as Brett mentioned, there is a 10-year crediting period. So what this means is that in every year for these 10 years, credits can be calculated relative to a baseline. So this means that during that 10-year period, if the school implements some strategy or some additional activities to further reduce emissions, then they will have more credits to verify and sell. At the same time, it also means if that during one of these years, for example, electricity use increases, then the school might actually not have any credits to generate and sell. And we've seen that happen with some schools, for unforeseen reasons, electricity use increased, and so they didn't have credits. And then in other cases, schools have performed better than they expected, and they were able to verify and sell more credits than they anticipated. And so, again, as I mentioned before, the Scope 1 stationary credits and the Scope 2 electricity-based credits are calculated separately. And schools have the option of generating credits from one of those scopes or from both. And then I included here, so the methodology actually comes with an Excel template that does most of the calculations for us. So this is just a screenshot of the first page of this Excel template. But how it works is that schools will enter their square footage data for every year, as well as the Scope 1 emissions and Scope 2 emissions. And then the Excel template does most of the calculations to determine, first of all, whether or not the school meets the additionality eligibility requirement. And it also determines how many credits the schools may or may not be able to verify and sell. And this is also so when the schools do their monitoring report, they will fill this out, and the verifiers will also, they will look at the Excel template in order to determine, whether the calculations were done correctly and if they need any, evidence to back up the credit calculations. And just as a quick note, the methodology does include adjustments for cases where the campus size is increasing or decreasing by more than 5% a year. So there's a separate Excel template that we can use to kind of normalize your emissions based on the campus size, because a lot of schools are expanding or some are losing square footage. So I just wanted to mention that. Next slide. So in summary, for schools that are interested in a campus-wide module, the data required, you do need to have a yearly greenhouse gas inventory. I know a lot of schools that report to Second Nature in the past, they've done their greenhouse gas inventories every other year because that is what Second Nature historically has required. But in order to enter all the data into the template for this methodology, you do need to have the yearly greenhouse gas emissions. So, again, you need your Scope 1 emissions and your Scope 2 emissions. You also need your campus square footage. And ideally, you would have all of this data from 2010 to the present. In some cases, we might not need to go back that far, but it is best if you can have like 5 or 6 continuous years of data in order to calculate the most accurate number of credits and to determine if your school is meeting the performance thresholds. And then I wanted to include here that carbon credits which are sold through this program, they cannot be counted as emissions reductions for your school's greenhouse gas inventory for that year. So we've had some questions in the past as to whether or not schools can sell the credits and then also count them, count the emissions reductions in their inventories. And the answer is no, because that would essentially be double counting. So, that's just something to think about if schools have carbon neutrality targets or, midway targets that are coming up and they want to be able to meet those. You might just need to consider whether or not you would be able to sell credits and still meet your targets. Next slide, please. Okay, so now I'm going to switch and start to talk about the LEED Certified Buildings module. So as I mentioned before, under this module, campuses register individual buildings as carbon credit projects and not the entire campus. And this can be one or more buildings. I will say that this module has been less popular. Most of the original 11 campuses, as well as the schools that continued with us, they did the campus-wide option, and that's just because there's more opportunity to generate a larger number of credits, whereas the LEED certified buildings are usually much smaller projects and a smaller number of credits. But the option is there. The LEED certified building module can be applied to 3 cases on your campus. The first case is for newly constructed projects. So in this case, if you're planning a new building that's going to be LEED certified, it might be possible to have the building generate some credits. In this case, the LEED building would need to meet and surpass a performance benchmark, which also is laid out by the methodology. This module can also be applied to buildings that are existing on your campus that previously had a performance level that would make them not qualified for LEED certification, but they're able to show a strong improvement in their energy use intensity over a single year. If they're able to show a drastic improvement, then they might be eligible to develop credits on that building. And then the third case is for existing buildings that are LEED certified. And again, the methodology outlines performance benchmark, and if the buildings meet that benchmark, then they may be eligible to develop credits. And similar to the Campuswide module, the LEED certified building module is it's a combination of performance benchmark and uses project-based calculations. So depending on the situation, for additionality in each of the 3 cases that I mentioned, the methodology outlines a performance benchmark method. However, for actually calculating the credits, it can be a combination of using a performance threshold or also looking at historical baseline to calculate credits. Next slide, please. So a little more detail of how the additionality performance benchmarks are determined for the LEED certified module. So these are slightly different in each of the 3 cases that I mentioned. For new construction projects, the methodology looks at the energy use intensity of the building relative to the regulatory code that is applied to it. For existing buildings A, which are the buildings that were previously not qualified for LEED certification, in order to be eligible under this methodology, they need to show a 20% improvement in their energy use intensity. And this improvement needs to happen in a single year. And then finally, for the existing buildings that are previously LEED certified, the additionality is determined by looking at the Energy Star score. So I believe they need an Energy Star score of at least an 86 to be eligible to generate credits under this methodology. So if you look at the table, you can see a little bit more detail as to what the performance benchmarks are in each situation, if it's new construction or if you're looking at existing buildings. And it's also, you might notice that it's broken down by building type. So this could actually apply to higher education buildings, laboratories, or K-12 schools might be able to generate credits for 1 or 2 buildings on their campus. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so as far as actually calculating the credits for LEED certified buildings, in each of these cases, we use the EPA tool called Target Finder. So again, it's a little bit different for each of the 3 cases. For the new construction and for the existing, for the building that's previously LEED certified, the way that the baseline is calculated, the baseline is considered to be a comparable building with an Energy Star score of 50. So what you would do is that you would use the Target Finder, you enter all the building relevant data into the Target Finder, but you assume an Energy Star score of 50, and then the Target Finder will produce the estimated emissions. So that's considered to be the baseline, and then the project emissions, you would enter all of the buildings relevant data, including the energy use and emissions, and so that is compared with the baseline to calculate the credits that the building has generated. And then for the existing buildings that were previously not LEED certified, the baseline, it is a historical baseline based on that building's actual previous energy use, and you would look at the past 3 to 5 years prior to the project. And those numbers, again, would be generated by using the Target Finder and entering the building's data into the Target Finder. So overall, the data that is going to be required if you're interested in pursuing the LEED certified building module, you use the LEED certification documents. You definitely would want to collect the building level energy use, and then again there is going to be some other evidence requested by the verifier, and that might be utility bills or more itemized energy use lists or photos of the project. Great. Next slide, please. So I think we're ready for some questions.
Yes, thanks, Ruby. So we received a first question about additionality. So basically, can you explain how, if the campuses are already reducing their emissions, through their regular activities, how do they prove that the reductions done under the protocols are additional? How does the energy efficiency credits meet the additionality test?
Right, that's a good question. So that's where the performance benchmark comes in. And the way performance benchmarks work is that you look at the industry and the industry average. So in this case, you'd be looking at higher education, and you look at the average annual emissions reductions for that. And then what this methodology did is more specifically, it's looking at schools that have carbon neutrality goals and are working towards their goals and reporting their inventories to the ACU-PCC. So the argument is that these schools are already leaders in the field. And to qualify for this methodology, the schools need to be in the top 15% of the leaders in the field. So the idea is that the schools that are going far, far above and beyond, and that are really exceptional in terms of their emissions reductions and their reducing their energy use yearly, then these schools, by nature of the their leadership and the high level that they're reducing emissions, they are considered to be additional.
Thanks. We had another question that I'll just go ahead and answer about the note that you said, schools cannot claim the reductions that are sold as credits, and how does that work? Does that mean that the real emissions for the school that they're publicly reporting must be increased by the amount of credits sold? Yes, and that's exactly right. So what you would do in your greenhouse gas inventory is you would have reductions in your scope 1 and 2 emissions that would be the emissions reductions that you're selling as carbon offsets. And then what you would do is you would take any tonnage, the exact tonnage of any offsets you sold, and you would add that back into your scope 3 emissions. So if people were looking at your greenhouse gas inventory, they would be able to see your emissions going down through the reductions in the efficiency, but your net emissions would be flat because you would be adding back into scope 3 any offsets that you had sold. And so basically the idea is that a campus that was going through this project would have a greenhouse gas inventory that would basically be flat over the period in which they were selling offsets, because they'd be having on-the-ground emissions reductions, but then any of those reductions would be sold off to a third party. So if you just looked at the graph of their net emissions, it would be flat over the years that they were selling those offsets. But then in the period when the offset sales stop, then those net emissions would drop back to whatever level they had reduced their emissions to. And the idea is that hopefully by generating this additional funding and investing it in additional energy efficiency reduction projects, when that drop in emission does happen at the end of the period in which you're selling offsets, that reduction would be much greater than it would be had you not raised that additional funds through the carbon offset sales. Let's see. So Ruby, could the LEED building module be opened to other green building certifications like the Living Building Challenge?
Yeah, that's a good question. So not under this specific methodology. The methodology would need to be altered, and that's a question that would go to VCS because they're the ones that approve and and certify this methodology. It's right. So it's currently not included, but I would encourage schools that are interested in that to to go to VCS and see what other types of buildings and situations could be included in this.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. We have a question about timing. How long does the whole process take from the time that you submit submit the initial project document, document description into how long, until you get paid for the credits? I can say that for the last round of projects with the 3 campuses that we were working with this past year, they had already had validated projects, so we were just going through the verification of their offsets for that particular fiscal year, that particular verification period. And we started working with the campuses, I would say, around late September, early October, just to get things organized. The verification process starts really at the end of the calendar year because you need to have all of your utility bills through the end of the calendar year and things like that before you can turn all that material over to the verifier. So then generally the verification process took from January to around early March, going in through towards maybe the end of March for some of the campuses. And then the process of working with the buyer and things, which was mostly on Second Nature's end, not as much the campus's end, although they had some questions to answer from the buyer, and the buyer took a tour of some of the campuses and things like that. So that process took probably until June, and then the funds were just distributed from that sale to the campuses probably about a month ago. So it takes probably, I'd say, roughly 9 months for the whole thing to happen, and it may take a little bit longer if a project is going through validation for the first time. So Ruby, this is a question I think you can answer about LEED buildings. If a campus is using the LEED building protocol, does it have to be a recent building? Is there a cutoff for the age of the construction of the building? So for example, would a newly constructed LEED building that opened in 2011 be eligible?
So if the building opened in 2011, it might be eligible through the LEED certified existing building options. Remember, there are 3 options that it could be applied to. So that would just depend if the building's performance, if their ENERGY STAR score, if their energy use intensity, if that meets the performance benchmark. And the one thing to note about bringing in older projects is that we're somewhat limited as far as grandfathering in older projects. So VCS, for this type of methodology, VCS requires that projects be validated within 2 years of their start date. And it's up to the schools to determine what they're going to, consider to be the start date, because, with both the Campuswide and the LEED certified buildings, it's more about meeting the performance benchmarks. So, we could say that 2015 is the project start date, and so that is the year that we could start to generate credits. But, the years before then, the school would need to meet the performance benchmark in order to be eligible. So it's possible that a building that's built in 2011 could be eligible depending on whether or not it meets the performance benchmark, but the start date for the project, when you could start to generate credits, at this point it would probably have to be either 2015 or 2016.
Great, thanks. Let's see what's another question we've gotten. So someone asks, are the credits sold on an annual basis? And if so, can you sell the credits 1 year and not sell them the next? And yes, that's each sale takes place on an annual basis. Each period needs to be independently verified from all the other periods. So basically, you go through an annual process of verification of the credits and then marketing of the credits. So once your project is established, you sort of have a 10-year window in which you could sell or not sell offsets on an annual basis. In some years, you might not have anything to sell if, for whatever reason, that year you didn't have a particularly high, emissions reduction, and it just, there either wasn't any carbon reduction in that period, or it was such a small amount that it's not worth the time and effort and expense to verify it. Or you might just decide that, in that particular year you're trying to meet a target and you don't want to sell any credits. So yeah, that's a choice. With the 5 campuses we've been working with, for example, in this particular verification period, only 3 of the 5 campuses sold their offsets. So that's definitely a decision that can happen on an annual basis. So Ruby, I think here's one that you can maybe address, and I can jump into as well. So if a campus has a renewable energy project, can they include the RECs from that, say it was campus solar or other renewable energy, can they include that in the reduction? And then, if not, what are the trade-offs between establishing RECs versus the carbon credits?
Right. So if you have a renewable energy project and you're selling the RECs, then you cannot count the emissions reductions associated with the RECs as the carbon, like as carbon credits, because that would be double counting the emissions reductions. So it's still possible to develop a project on your campus. However, any emissions reductions that are associated with RECs that are being sold, they would have to be excluded from the calculations in terms of what can be generated as carbon credits.
Mm-hmm.
And then as far as the price trade-off, I mean, I think that it kind of depends on the situation. So, we're estimating the market price for credits to be between $6 to $10. If you're in, Massachusetts selling SRECs, that's probably more valuable. But it's going to depend on the school and the situation, I think.
Right. Yeah, I think that's going to vary from state to state because the REC markets are, for the most part, state-driven. So you should be able to kind of see what the prices for RECs are in your state and know sort of what would be the equivalent carbon reduction if if you were to retain the RECs and not sell them. How many offsets would you get for that? That same thing, and sort of compare the price. If okay, well, we could generate $6 to $10 for an offset, but here is what we could get if we did RECs instead. You could balance that out, deciding whether to include the renewable energy reductions in the voluntary offsets or to separate them and do voluntary offsets for everything other than the RECs that you sold. And usually what we did last round was we sort of developed each campus kind of let us know what their sort of ideal price was in different categories of this is what the price we're looking for. We won't go any lower than this price. And we're able to use that to help find a price from a buyer that suited what the campuses were looking for. And so a campus could certainly say, we won't go anywhere below this price because at that price point it would make more sense for us to sell the RECs instead of being in the voluntary offset market. So Ruby, there's a question about annual weather conditions. So how are the annual weather conditions affected in this the spreadsheet? Do you track heating degree days, and can the user sort of normalize for weather when they're doing their reduction calculations?
Yes, the answer is yes. The Excel template does include normalization for the heating degree days and the cooling degree days. So, you would need to enter that data as well, and that will, determine the number of credits you have. So the short answer is yes.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question that I don't immediately know the answer to, Ruby, and maybe you do. So for tax purposes, how is the revenue generated from offset sales treated by a private institution?
That is a good question. I don't know.
I don't know either. I think we could find out from some of our participating campuses because they've now gone through sort of 2 rounds of sales, so they should have a sense. I think it's probably just general revenue, but I don't really know. That's a good question. Thanks for. Yeah. So there's a couple of questions sort of about general demand for offsets. So Chevy is no longer purchasing these credits. Are there other buyers? Is there demand? A couple of different questions that are along those lines. So do you have any thoughts about that, Ruby?
Yeah. So that's interesting. So overall, the trend for the voluntary market is that, in the past year or so, prices have actually been lower, but demand has been higher. So that says that, more companies, individuals, it's mostly, large corporations are looking to buy offsets, but there is a large supply. So, in the kind of general pool, the prices have been lower. And that being said, we've found that these campus carbon credits, it's more of a, boutique market, I would say, and we've been able to to get higher prices for the credits. And these projects are really attractive because, first of all, they are based in the U.S. So there's, a good degree of trust in these types of projects. And they've also been attractive because they're associated with higher education, and there are so many benefits beyond just the credits that the schools are selling. So these are all schools that are working towards carbon neutrality. The revenues are being reinvested into further emissions reductions on campus, as well as educational benefits, research benefits. So we found that that there is a demand for these types of projects, and that buyers are interested in the campus carbon credits.
Great, yeah, and that's what I've found as well. When we've been issuing credits and the projects are listed on VCS, several buyers have reached out to Second Nature and asked if we have more credits, are we generating more, are more campuses getting into this market? So there's a lot of interest, I think, around particularly any credits that are in North America and the US, like Ruby said, and also I think there's interest potentially from other people in the higher ed sector looking to, purchase credits from a trusted person who's also in higher ed. So I think there's a lot of interest in these type of credits. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was just going to say that's a good point as well that we've been thinking about, is that as schools are getting closer towards their carbon neutrality dates and starting to think about offsets and how offsets are going to be incorporated into their strategy, I think there's a lot of synergies between campuses probably looking to other campuses to source some of their offsets.
Mm-hmm. And we had a few questions about the costs of participating in the program,
mm-hmm.
How that works for the campuses. Can you sort of just walk through the procedure of how we, cover the verification costs and?
Yeah. So this, going through the whole process of developing carbon credits, it can be a pretty expensive process. And I think that's one of the greatest benefits of going through the process as a group, as we've done with the schools, and then also working with an organization like Second Nature. So what we're planning to do is that Second Nature, so the upfront costs, there are costs associated with maintaining a registry. So we have a registry in order to be able to access the market. There's also costs associated with validation and verification. And that can range from, between a couple thousand per campus to more, depending on, how extensive the review needs to be and if the third parties want to do a site visit. And there are also some fees associated with actually getting the credits issued to from VCS. So it can be expensive, especially for smaller projects, because there's a number of fixed costs. So it makes sense to have a larger group to spread some of the costs out through a large number of credits. So what Second Nature has done is that we are able to front the verification and all the registry fees, so the campuses don't need to worry about that initially, because we found that it can be hard for campuses to have that kind of capital to start with. And then once a sale is made of carbon credits, then Second Nature will take a flat amount per credit in order to reimburse for those costs. So the short answer is that the campuses, the only cost for campuses is in terms of the time devoted into collecting data and writing up these reports.
Yeah, and I should also add that just hopefully the idea is that by aggregating, we can get lower costs. So if individual campus went to a verifier for third-party verification, it could be in the ballpark of $5,000 or $6,000 or more to validate a project. But what we found that if we bundle the projects from 3, 4, or 5 campuses and go to a verifier, we can get a slightly lower cost per project, and then then we're able to split that over all of the campuses in the project and campuses not only do not have to pay those costs up front because Second Nature is handling all of that, but also they're getting hopefully a lower price for the verification than they would if everyone was doing it individually. So Ruby, can you talk a little bit about the expansion in your work in New England, and are you looking for just campuses in New England, or are you, thinking about expanding nationally and things like that?
Sure. So over the past year, Second Nature has been increasing our focus and our work in the region. So Second Nature has received a grant to focus, some projects specifically in the New England region. So I've been working more closely with schools in New England, and one thing that we're hoping to do is, bring some New England schools on board into C2P2. So we've kind of targeted New England schools where, we're thinking that having schools that are close to each other and, in similar locations might help with some of the verification and the validation. It might, enable us to get a better price for, for those processes. But that we're also hoping to connect New England to, some of the projects and the initiatives that are going on in the rest of the network. We're definitely not excluding other schools, and if other schools are outside of New England, interested and they have credits to generate, then we're definitely happy to go through the process. But we have been kind of focusing the expansion and some of the information specifically in New England to try to connect the region with the rest of the network.
Great. Let's see. There's a few more questions, and then I think we will have to wrap up shortly. There's a question about are the offsets Green E certified? And the answer is no. Green E is a program for renewable energy credits, so that's renewable energy generation projects in the grid-connected electricity generating projects. This is a voluntary carbon offset market, which is a different thing. So in this case, the offsets would be VCS certified, so verified voluntary carbon standard. So that's the program we're using for certification in this case, because it's an offset program, not a renewable energy credit program. And then here's a question about existing renewable energy projects. I'm not sure I can answer this one. Maybe Ruby, you can. So could you do this if you had an existing solar project on your campus? Would you be able to count would that count for going through the Campus-Wide module, I guess, assuming you obtained any recs from the project and stuff?
Yeah, so the Campus-Wide, it really depends, I guess, when the solar project came online as to whether or not it would be considered part of the baseline or part of the project crediting period when you can generate credits. But the thing with the Campus-Wide is that it's overall campus emissions. So we're not looking, it's open. It includes any renewable energy, any systems that you have on campus. It's just a matter of looking over the past 5 to 6 years, looking at the emissions data and seeing if overall across campus your scope 1 and your scope 2 has decreased enough to reach the performance benchmarks, and then whether or not you have enough credits relative to the baseline, to make it worthwhile to go forward.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. Here's a question about, let's see, could a school retire the verified credits for their own use towards a carbon neutrality goal? Yeah, you could do that. I think the barrier would be, since these are internal reductions already, you don't need to, if you wanted to just achieve carbon neutrality, you wouldn't need to go through the verification process. You could just have the emissions reductions count towards your normal scope 1 and 2 greenhouse gas inventory. and you would retain those reductions yourself, and they move you on your way towards carbon neutrality. This is more, the idea behind this is more as a way to generate capital to help accelerate that path to carbon neutrality. So the idea being that if you were to sell some offsets, like in the short term, you wouldn't have any reductions towards your carbon neutrality goal, but you would be raising money that you could invest in additional projects and then hopefully reach neutrality sooner than you would. So if you're just trying to achieve your carbon neutrality goal, it's not necessary to go through the process of verifying offsets and then retiring them yourself if you're only interested in that reduction. You'd only be sort of interested in the program if you're trying to generate some funding for a green revolving fund or something like that that would help you get more reductions than you would ordinarily. So it's 3:30, so I would just like to say thank you everyone for joining the webinar, and as I said at the beginning, the recording and the slides will be available and will be distributed to participants very shortly. So thank you, and goodbye.